Decoded.
Welcome to Book Decoded. Are you ready to unlock some really hidden gems and maybe some mind-blowing moments from the pages of history?
I think we are.
Good. Today we're diving headfirst into a whirlwind tour of France, thanks to the very insightful Shortest History of France by Colin Jones.
Great book, really packs a punch for its size.
Oh, it does.
Yeah.
And forget dry timelines. We're extracting the surprising, the pivotal, and frankly, the downright fascinating nuggets that'll give you a totally fresh perspective on this iconic nation. Let's get decoding. Okay, so France. When you think early France, what comes to mind? Maybe Gauls, Romans.
That's the common picture, yeah.
Well, the book immediately throws a curveball. The very first king, Clovis Merovingian dynasty, way back like 5th to 8th centuries, he wasn't really French in the modern sense.
Right. He was German, a Frank.
Exactly, a German king, and he chose Paris as the Frankish capital around 508.
And then you jump forward a bit.
To the first emperor, Charlemagne. Carolingian dynasty, also German. His reign, late 8th, early 9th century, massive cultural renaissance. Crowned in Rome, 800.
It really does challenge that neat, tidy French origin story we sometimes imagine.
It totally does. It suggests this whole idea of a single pure origin is, well, more of a later construction.
Absolutely. National identity is rarely that simple at the start. It's woven together over time, often from quite different threads. These Germanic roots are undeniable.
And it wasn't just the rulers, was it? The language itself, what we call French, had a really slow, gradual development.
Oh, for sure. The book mentions the Strasbourg Oaths in 842. That's a key moment where you see French and German starting to, diverge linguistically.
But even when Hugh Capet becomes king of the West Franks in 987, and he's often called the first monarch of France,
it still takes ages, centuries really, for a distinct French linguistic identity to properly form across the whole area.
Right. It's this idea of an ancient, clearly defined France from day one. Much more of a slow burn.
Which is typical for language evolution, really. Political boundaries shift, people mix, language adapts slowly.
Okay, switching gears a bit. Climate change. Not something you immediately link with, say, medieval France.
But it was hugely important, as the book points out. A real roller coaster.
Yeah, first this late antique Little Ice Age, roughly 530 to 660. Colder times, right when the Merovingians were starting out.
Then it warms up, the medieval warm period, maybe 950 to 1250.
Which is exactly when Hugh Capet and the early Capetians are consolidating power. Interesting timing, right?
Very. And then it flips again. The big one, the Little Ice Age, from about 1350 all the way to the mid-1800s.
Wow, that covers the 100 Years' War, the lead up to the Revolution. You got to think that impacted farming society.
Oh, undoubtedly. Major climate shifts like that affect everything. Harvests, health, resources, possibly even contributing to social unrest. It shows France has this long history of adapting or trying to adapt.
Okay, let's lighten the mood. French food. The baguette.
Ah, oui. The symbol. UNESCO heritage now, too.
Exactly. Quintessentially French, you'd think. But, get this. According to the book, invented in Paris, 1837.
By an Austrian baker, August Zang.
An Austrian. It's amazing, isn't it, how something can become so deeply embedded in one culture, but its origins are actually elsewhere.
It's a perfect example of cultural borrowing and transformation. Happens all the time with food. Things travel, get adapted, and then become local icons.
And that theme, France being shaped by outsiders,
Yeah.
it just keeps popping up.
It really does. It's fundamental.
Think about Napoleon, born in Corsica. If he'd been born just 1 year earlier.
He'd been Genoese.
Okay.
Italian. Corsica only became French just before his birth. Amazing timing.
Right. And then you look at who's honored in the Pantheon in Paris.
Yeah.
Marie Curie, Polish. Alexandre Dumas, his grandmother, was enslaved in the Caribbean.
And the book notes how many French-language Nobel Literature laureates since 45 have roots outside mainland France, the hexagon.
It really paints this picture of France as a melting pot, constantly being enriched by people arriving from all over. It challenges any narrow definition of French.
That's precisely it. This history of immigration isn't a footnote. It's central to the story. France has always absorbed and been changed by newcomers.
It's almost like France has this talent for taking things in ideas, people, even food, putting a unique French spin on them.
and then re-exporting them as something recognizably French.
Yeah, the book hints at this. Like France is this hub for transforming things and then sharing its version with the world.
It speaks to a certain cultural dynamism, an ability to adapt and innovate, to make things its own, and then project that outwards. It's been a key part of its global influence.
Let's jump way back again. Roman Gaul, those famous Roman roads.
Built for the legions, primarily, moving troops quickly.
But the one points out they had huge economic side effects. They boosted trade, connected regions, helped cities like Marseille flourish.
It's a classic case of infrastructure having multiple, sometimes unintended benefits. Good roads help trade, communication, the spread of ideas, not just soldiers.
And speaking of early days, the Franks. What's interesting is how they operated after Rome's power faded in the West.
Unlike some other groups who are more nomadic.
The Franks, particularly the Salian Franks, basically stayed put. They settled inside the old Roman frontiers, the lines.
A strategic choice, really, allowed them to consolidate power more effectively.
And Clovis, their leader, eventually defeats the Roman general Syagrius in 486.
Yeah.
The book has this great line about him being a Romanized barbarian prevailing over a barbarized Roman.
It captures that complex transition period perfectly, and staying put, building a power base within that old Roman framework, proved very successful for them long term.
Okay, another concept from the Merovingian era, the roi fainéants.
Ah, yes, the do-nothing kings. A bit harsh, maybe, but it reflects a real decline in central authority later on.
Seems like the system fragmented. Kings started paying off followers with land or loot, which just weakened their own position.
Exactly. Power drains away from the center and into the hands of others.
Like the mayors of the palace. By the 7th century, figures like Charles Martel's ancestors were the ones really running the show.
While the kings became largely ceremonial, it's a fascinating cycle centralization, fragmentation, then often a new power rising from the fragments.
Speaking of Charles Martel,
Yeah.
his victory at Tours in 732, often portrayed as this epic clash, saving Christendom from Islam.
That's the traditional narrative, certainly. The hammer stopping the Umayyad advance.
But the book offers a slightly different angle. It suggests maybe the Muslim incursions were more like raids for plunder, rather than full-scale conquest attempts into Francia.
Right. The richer areas further south might have been the primary targets. And it also mentions how Islamic raiders back then kind of looked down on the Franks.
Yeah, suggesting the Franks weren't seen as this great intellectual power. The Arab world had preserved much more of the classical Roman knowledge at that point.
It's a good reminder that history often depends on who's telling the story and what their perspective is. The significance of Tours might look different depending on whether you're reading Frankish or Islamic sources.
Now, Charles Martel's grandson, Charlemagne, we mentioned him earlier, the German emperor, he was big on education, wasn't he?
Very much so, but filtered through a Christian lens. He saw antiquity via the church. Latin was key. Promoting the faith was key.
So he supported monasteries.
Hugely.
Yeah.
Monastic libraries were the main repositories of classical knowledge, and he founded that palace school at Aix-la-Chapelle, bringing in top scholars like Alcuin of York from England. It was a conscious effort to preserve and promote learning, albeit within that specific religious framework. A foundational investment, you could say.
But Charlemagne's empire, strong as it was, didn't last forever in that form. It faced threats from multiple directions later on.
Right, the late 8th and 9th centuries were tough. You had Vikings raiding from the north and west.
Saracens, essentially Muslim pirates and raiders, hitting the Mediterranean coast and even parts of the interior.
And the Magyars coming from the east, raiding into what's now Germany and eastern France. A triple threat.
And the inability of the later Carolingian rulers to effectively stop these raids really eroded confidence in the empire, didn't it?
Absolutely. Security is a primary function of rule. When the rulers can't protect the people, faith in them declines, and power tends to fragment locally, which sets the stage for
the rise of the Capetians. With you, Capet, in 987. But the book says France around the year 1000 was still just a shaky outline on a map.
Pretty much. The early Capetian kings directly controlled only a small area around Paris, the Ile-de-France. Their authority over the powerful dukes and counts elsewhere was limited, often just nominal.
So how did they consolidate power? It seems the long struggle against the English, or rather the Anglo-Normans, was crucial.
Yes, especially under kings like Philip II, Philip Augustus. His victory at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214 was massive.
Thanks to him.
It was a coalition, but critically, it involved the English King John and the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV. Philip's win seriously weakened English power on the continent and really cemented Capetian dominance within France.
So sometimes facing a powerful external enemy helps forge internal unity.
It often does. It forces cooperation and helps define who we are against them.
Now, another major French undertaking in the medieval period, the Crusades.
Ah, yes, very much a French affair in many ways, especially the early ones.
The council that launched the First Crusade was in Clermont, in France. French knights and nobles were heavily involved.
So much so that the Crusader states set up in the Levant were often called France d'outre-mer, overseas France. French was a common language among the Crusaders.
And apparently even Muslim sources often just called all Crusaders Franche or Farang Franks.
It really highlights the central role French knights and the French church played in that whole movement.
And back home, society had this really defined structure, the three estates.
Right, the classic medieval division. Orators, those who pray the clergy.
Bellators, those who fight the nobility.
And laborators, those who work, which was basically everyone else, the vast majority. And the church, the first estate, held enormous power and land.
And architecturally, this period gives us Gothic style.
Born near Paris, at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, north of the city, around 1130, Abbé Suger was the driving force.
And the Capetian kings approved.
They did. It became associated with the monarchy and spread rapidly across France and then Europe. Those soaring cathedrals, Chartres, Reims, Notre Dame, and Paris are iconic examples.
Okay, let's jump forward to the 100 Years' War. And Joan of Arc. Such a famous figure, but maybe more complex than just a saint.
Definitely. The book mentions she was also known as Joan the Maiden, or Joan of Lorraine. Her birthplace had connections to the Holy Roman Empire, not just France.
And her impact was undeniable. Her charisma rallied the French under Charles VII, lifted the siege of Orleans, got him crowned properly at Reims.
Crucial moment. She really turned the tide psychologically, but her end was tragic.
Captured, sold to the English, tried for heresy, burned at the stake, and Charles VII, the king she helped crown,
Did nothing to save her. It's a stark reminder that national heroes often have complex, even grim stories.
But France did eventually win the 100 Years' War. How did that happen?
A couple of key things. The powerful Duke of Burgundy switched sides, abandoning the English alliance and backing the French Valois kings. That was huge.
And then military victories.
Yes. The French gradually pushed the English back, retook Paris in 1436. The final nail was the Battle of Castillon in 1453. After that, England lost all its French territories except Calais.
So the French monarchy finally shook off that centuries-long English entanglement on French soil.
A major turning point. Really allowed France to emerge as a more unified, independent kingdom.
Then comes the Renaissance. But it seems France got involved in Italy militarily, in the Italian wars, but maybe gained more culturally.
That's a fair assessment. The wars themselves, late 15th, early 16th centuries, didn't result in lasting French territorial gains in Italy, but the exposure to the Italian Renaissance, transformative.
So French kings started bringing back Italian artists.
Exactly. Leonardo da Vinci ending up in France is the most famous example. Humanist ideas flowed north. Italian became fashionable, the language of high culture for a time. Books like Castiglione's The Courtier influenced French manners and court life.
Culture as a form of influence, then.
Absolutely. Sometimes more lasting than military conquest.
Around the same time, another revolution, printing, started around 1450, huge for spreading Renaissance ideas.
Immense. Accelerated the spread of knowledge like nothing before. But it was a double-edged sword.
How so?
Because it also fueled the religious conflicts of the Reformation, cheap pamphlets, provocative woodcuts. They spread religious arguments and animosity incredibly quickly.
Right. And the book mentions travel literature became popular too, thanks to print, mixing facts with myths.
Yes, books like The Supposed Travels of Sir John Mandeville were bestsellers. They shaped how Europeans saw the wider world, often mixing genuine accounts with fantasy and prejudice.
Fast forward a bit to Louis XIV, the Sun King. He revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685. What was that about?
The Edict of Nantes from 1598 had granted substantial rights and tolerance to Calvinist Protestants, the Huguenots, ending the earlier wars of religion. Revoking it ended that tolerance.
So Protestantism became illegal again.
Essentially, yes. It led to forced conversions, Huguenots fleeing France, a brain drain, really an even armed rebellion, like the Camisard War in the South. A big step backwards for religious tolerance. Significant social and economic costs, definitely.
But French culture and language were really taking off internationally around then.
Oh, absolutely. While English is the global lingua franca now, French became hugely important in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was the language of diplomacy, science, high society across Europe.
The book mentions clarity, making it good for academies, and gallantry, making it the language of romance.
Exactly. It was seen as sophisticated, precise, a major tool of French soft power. But, ironically,
Within France itself, many people didn't speak French as their first language yet.
precisely, regional languages and dialects were still very strong. French was the language of the elite and administration, but not necessarily the everyday language for a lot of the population.
Then comes the Enlightenment and the
Mm.
Encyclopédie.
A monumental project. Edited by Diderot and d'Alembert, published between 1751 and 1772. The goal was amazing. Compile all human knowledge systematically, but without being bound by traditional theology.
Looking beyond Europe, too.
Yes, incorporating new knowledge from global exploration and trade. Its success, despite attempts to censor it, really showed the Bourbon monarchy was losing its grip on controlling the flow of ideas.
Which leads us towards the Revolution. Was it all about Enlightenment philosophy or something more practical?
Well, the ideas were definitely in the air, providing justification. But the book argues the trigger was arguably more about state bankruptcy. France was broke.
So Louis VI calling the Estates General in 1788,
Yeah.
that was about taxes.
Primarily, yes, he needed consent for financial reform, but it backfired spectacularly. The Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly.
The tennis court oath, the storming of the Bastille in 89, sovereignty shifted from the king to the nation.
A fundamental change. And then came the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen.
August 1789. Such a foundational document. Sovereignty in the nation, individual freedoms guaranteed.
Its ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity have echoed around the world ever since, even if the reality of implementing them has always been, well, complicated.
And that complication comes up with colonialism, doesn't it? The revolution's ideals spread.
To places like the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, it inspired the massive slave revolt starting in 1791.
The French National Convention did abolish slavery in 1794.
Briefly. But the struggle in Haiti was brutal. Toussaint Louverture led the fight, and Haiti declared independence in 1804 after defeating French forces sent by Napoleon, who'd actually reinstated slavery.
It was the world's first successful slave revolt leading to an independent nation. A huge moment.
Absolutely world historic, but it shows the deep contradictions between revolutionary ideals proclaimed in France and the realities of its overseas empire.
And Napoleon's own empire in Europe.
Yeah.
Was it spreading liberty, or was it a new kind of colonialism?
The book suggests it often felt like the latter to the conquered peoples. Sure, some revolutionary reforms were introduced, but there were also heavy taxes, conscription, exploitation of resources.
Yeah.
More like colonial rule in many ways.
Later in the 19th century, this idea of the civilizing mission emerges. What was that?
It became the dominant justification for French colonial expansion, especially from the 1820s and 30s onwards. The idea was that France had a duty to bring its supposedly superior culture, language, and institutions to other parts of the world.
A way to rationalize conquest and rule.
Pretty much. And it was showcased back home.
Ah, the Paris Expositions Universelles, the world fairs.
Exactly. From the mid-19th century on, these massive fairs were used to popularize the colonial empire. They displayed goods, crafts, and even people from the colonies, often in idealized, sometimes deeply racist ways, creating a spectacle of empire for the French public.
Moving into the late 19th, early 20th century, World War I looms. What was the mood in France?
The book points to the impact of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. France's defeat and loss of Alsace and Lorraine to Germany fostered this spirit of la revanche, revenge.
So history teaching in schools emphasized this.
Yes, in the Third Republic schools, history lessons often promoted a secular version of the civilizing mission, but also painted Germany as the hereditary enemy, building support for eventual payback. WWI was seen by many as that chance.
And the war itself was devastating for France.
A national trauma, huge loss of life. But victory came at immense cost.
Then World War II, occupation, Vichy France. A very difficult period to confront later.
Extremely complex. After 1944, the dominant story promoted was one of widespread French resistance against the Nazis and the collaborating Vichy regime.
But the reality was more mixed.
Much more. Collaboration was significant, driven by various motives. Acknowledging the extent of it and the nuances of resistance and accommodation became the subject of intense memory wars in France decades later. Still sensitive.
And after WWII, the French Empire, which has seemed so vast, it crumbled pretty quickly.
surprisingly quickly in some ways. Despite initial efforts to hold on, the post-war era saw rapid decolonization.
Even under de Gaulle. He seemed quite attached to the idea of French grandeur.
He did initially. He spoke of the civilizing mission. But ultimately, he recognized the inevitable and oversaw much of the process, though often amidst bitter conflicts, most notably the Algerian War.
After the war and decolonization, France entered a period of boom time, the Trente Glorieuses.
The 30 Glorious Years, roughly 1945 to 1975, a period of really rapid economic growth, industrialization, rising living standards, a baby boom, huge social transformation.
But not perfect.
No, there were still inequalities, regional disparities, and the boom eventually faltered in the mid-70s due to global economic factors like the oil crisis.
And then came 1968, May 68. Not quite a revolution, but still significant.
Hugely significant culturally and socially, even if it wasn't a political overthrow. The student protests and worker strikes challenged traditional authority, shook up social norms.
Leading to longer-term changes.
Yes, it fueled new social movements, feminism, gay rights, anti-racism, environmentalism. It had a lasting impact on French society and culture, even if the political system remains stable.
And more recently, those memory wars you mentioned seem to have intensified. Over Vichy, over colonialism.
Yes, debates about how to remember and teach the more difficult aspects of the past have become quite prominent. And these debates have sometimes been exploited.
By the far right?
The far right has often instrumentalized these sensitive historical issues, sometimes promoting revisionist narratives and linking them to contemporary anxieties about immigration, identity, and Islam, often fueling xenophobia.
So where does that leave France today, according to this shortest history?
Well, it portrays France as still a significant global power, culturally influential. That soft power idea persists, but it's also a nation grappling with these ongoing questions about its identity, the legacy of its complex history, how to integrate diverse populations. The story isn't over.
Wow. Okay, who knew a short history
Yeah.
could be so incredibly packed with surprising twists and, well, just turns?
It really covers a lot of ground, doesn't it?
From German kings to Austrian baguettes, a nation shaped just as much by outsiders as insiders. France's story is a constant reminder that history is never simple. It's messy.
It certainly is, full of contradictions and unexpected connections.
We really hope this decoding session has sparked your curiosity and maybe given you a richer understanding of the forces that have shaped modern France.
What surprised you the most listening to this? What questions are still buzzing around?
Yeah, keep exploring. The story of France, like, any nation, is an ongoing conversation. Thanks so much for joining us on Book Decoded.